Welcome to the Health Science Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. We're sponsored by the National Health Association. And today I'm really delighted to welcome as my guest, Stuart Evans. Stuart is an animal rights activist, advocate, who is also the founder of the Animal Alliance Project. He's also a philosopher. We're going to get into the importance of that in our discussion. And he's very much involved in really getting behind programs involved in animal, environmental, and social justice programs. So welcome, Stuart. It's a pleasure to have you.
Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, the NHA's Director of Health Education.
Thank you for having me, Frank. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, just as a point of introduction, so people get to know you, I was looking at one of your TED Talk that you did, and you made the point that you had spent quite a bit of time in the sale of pianos and guitars. So my first question is, how does someone with that background segue into your deep interest in philosophy, animal rights, environmental rights, and this whole field? Just give us a little background of how that transition and transformation took place.
Yeah, I mean, blimey, it's just been a journey for sure. I think the biggest transformation happened when I took a little bit of a sabbatical after my time working in sales and retail. So for the longest time, I've been a musician, been an advocate of the arts, and been playing for a lot of my teenage and adult life guitar personally, so guitar and vocals. But I decided, along with my partner, now wife, to go to Australia and to sort of like try and see a bit more of the world. This was, pre-pandemic, me really understanding anything about climate change or the climate crisis. It was just about the time where I turned vegan, actually. So I was vegan for about a year and a half, 2 years by this point. So we went over to Australia in October of 2019. And it was sort of about that time when all the wildfires were kicking off. So we were staying in sort of East Melbourne at that point. And we had this amazing time over there, like really trying to get involved with the culture and really, really seeing what other parts of the planet had in store. I mean, we're not talking wildly different from the UK in suburban Melbourne, but it was different enough for a small town guy like myself. But definitely, I think that was a real turning point, seeing such ferocious wildfires kind of sweep across, massive swathes of the countryside in Melbourne and the surrounding, and surrounding parts of southern Australia as well. So that kind of got me thinking, what's going on here? There seems to be some real environmental catastrophes going on. What's happening? So that kind of led me down this path of thinking, well, what can I do for the planet? And having already been, somewhat of an animal rights advocate, being a vegan myself and kind of questioning forms of order and why things are the way that they are, it kind of led me on this path of like, well, I want to do more. I want to do more than just sell. I want to do more with my life and really kind of push the boundary in my own sphere and think, well, what can I do to help the world, essentially? Delusions of grandeur, maybe. So obviously everything locked down with the pandemic and, that whole thing happened. So my wife and I were sort of thinking, well, what are we going to do? We'd never been to university, so we sort of applied for that and we got in. And I went to study liberal arts for the first year, and that was really, really fun. But my sort of the head of liberal arts, he said to me, "Stuart, you seem to just be focusing philosophy." And I'm like, well, I really love the arts and I love humanities and I love poetry and I love all these other things that the liberal arts hold. And he's like, yeah, but you can just do a philosophy degree and still like those things. So I was like, okay. So in my second and third years at university, I studied philosophy basically and really, really tried to push on climate change and animal rights and environmental rights and say, well, what are the the factors that have led us to think this certain way about the environment and the animals around us? And that's a sort of the segue from art.
That was kind of the segue for you. Are you still involved in the arts? Are you still playing music? Are you still involved?
I am. Yeah, still out and playing and stuff. Yeah. It's definitely taken a bit of a step back in my life. I still love it a lot, but yeah.
Had you done that on a professional level?
Semi-professional. Yeah.
No,
I was
okay.
Yeah, I was doing a lot of playing and a lot of session work for about sort of 5-10 years, and that was good fun. It was a really eye-opening thing to have such a creative endeavor, and looking back on it, going, "Wow, I was doing some really cool stuff." I was doing tours around Europe and a lot around the UK, but that sort of changed, obviously, with more understanding of how the climate crisis is affected by travel and personal choices and all that sort of stuff.
So you had made the point that you had previous to that journey had already made a transition to veganism in terms of your own life and times of eating habits. Were there any provocations of that? Were there any health issues or things that were the aha moments for that? Or what was the motivation for that change in your life? How did that come to be?
So interestingly, it's not something that was brought on by any health awareness. Ironically, I mean, obviously the health benefits aside, I lost a load of weight from going plant-based and came much more into a natural rhythm of my own body, which was nice. But no, it was actually on Facebook. I did one of the videos of, I think it was either Dominion or Cowspiracy, just popped up. And it was a part of the movie where essentially you see a cow being slaughtered. Right. And it was such a visceral moment just seeing this event happen. And I was just sort of left like, what did I just watch?
You're flabbergasted by the whole process. I know, it's amazing to watch that.
Exactly. And I'm thinking to myself, this isn't humane. This isn't what I had in my head, So right. That kind of just cut off everything for me. So I pretty much went vegetarian overnight because my own moral compass at that point was like, I can't deal with this. I couldn't do this to an animal, so I won't do it. Continued to eat dairy and eggs, and then obviously, as you do, that sort of thing that sort of eats away at the back of your brain. But like, well, hang on, if this is what they do there, what are they doing over here? And yeah, so I went vegan in the Veganuary of I think 2015 or a little bit before maybe. And yeah, just thought, okay, let's give veganism a try and see what happens. And
what's been remarkable and impressive to me is that, I go back and forth to England because I have a partner in England, is the explosion of veganism in the UK. It's been really a remarkable development and a really incredible inspiration, I think, for a lot of other Western countries to think about and look at, because no matter where you go, it's so funny to me, in restaurants in the UK, there's always some vegan option, and there's always something that so many places have now incorporated into their menus and presentation. So it's kind of a beautiful transition that you see happening, even in a smaller country as yours, to see this explosion of this way of eating and thinking and living, which is great.
I do agree. And I think actually it's testament to a lot of people over here where they do, a lot of English people hold the narrative that we are great animal lovers. And it doesn't take too long just to pick away at that in general conversation. And they're like, oh, I love dogs, I love animals. You're like, well, how much do you love them? Would you eat them? Oh, well, yeah, I buy my meat from like the butchers down the road, and I have humane meat. And I'm like, okay, but let's actually look at that a bit more. If people are willing to have the conversation, they quickly recognize that cognitive dissonance, and they're very readily able to say, actually, I'm not doing a good thing. I will try to change. But it's just keeping that sort of like grip hold and say, okay, you want to make that change, do it for yourself, do it for the animals. Like, this isn't a difficult thing to do. As you say, we've got so many different options here. Not all of them healthy, but hey, if you're doing it for the animals.
Yeah, that's part of it. I'm here with Stuart Evans, the founding director of the Animal Alliance Project. We're going to take just a very short break to hear from our sponsor, the National Health Association, and we'll be right back.
You're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. Dr. Frank Sabatino here. Are you ready for an extraordinary adventure that combines relaxation, exploration, and vibrant health? Then set your sails for the NHA plant-exclusive cruises. Imagine cruising through exotic destinations, savoring delectable plant-based cuisine, and engaging in rejuvenating activities, all while surrounded by like-minded individuals passionate about health and wellness. These cruises offer more than just a vacation. They offer an opportunity to immerse yourself in the NHA's principles of healthy living. And they rank incredibly high on the ratings of eco-friendly cruise lines. We all know how important our oceans are, and our cruise partner Windstar is fully committed to this. Join us aboard our upcoming plant-exclusive cruises and experience the synergy of health and leisure. Delight in gourmet SOS-free meals prepared by talented chefs, attend informative workshops, and enjoy the serenity of the sea, all tailored to nourish your body, mind, and spirit. For more details and to reserve your spot on our next adventure, visit healthscience.org and click the link under travel. Don't miss this chance to indulge in a wellness retreat like no other. Elevate your well-being and make memories that will last a lifetime. And remember, your feedback matters. Please take a moment to leave a rating and a review wherever you're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. I'm Dr. Frank Sabatino, your host. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to the Health Science Podcast. I'm here with Stuart Evans, the director of the Animal Alliance Project. Yeah, I want to get into a little bit of nitty gritty with you because I was really pleasantly impressed and surprised in listening to your TED Talk. You know, there's always that statement that people make that if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat the mistakes that history has provided and created. And that can certainly be said for the history and the evolution of modern European philosophy, which is really a good way to look at a lot of the quandary that we're kind of in right now. And you make a very good case in your talk for taking a close look at the why of what's happening now being grounded in these models that we can go way back, but really fostered really through the 17th and 18th century as we go from the mechanistic worldview paradigm with the architects like Descartes and Francis Bacon and Newton into the economists like Adam Smith and the social activists like John Locke. And you trace this idea of the fact that we make these choices that can be so disconnected from what is really the intrinsic value of nature, being based on these models that fed the idea that we were basically above nature, that nature really only did not have any intrinsic value. Its only real value was in the way that it could be monetized and usurped for personal gain. So why don't you take people through a little bit of your worldview in terms of addressing where we are now on that backbone of that evolution of the Western European philosophical tradition. I think it has value because I think a lot of people are not aware of how much we operate now based on those very ancient models of philosophy.
100%. I mean, especially in the sort of the global north, we work within these paradigms and these sort of knowledge frameworks or epistemological frameworks of, enlightenment, essentially, sort of 17th, 18th century enlightenment, especially in Europe. We work upon these notions of what it is to be human. And there was a real juxtaposition to be had in this time of thinking, because obviously, the transatlantic slave movement was such a big part of our history in sort of the colonial north, and especially like England. We look to the Americas, we look to the Australias, we look to New Zealand, we look to a lot of colonized nations and areas across the world. And at the one point, you've got these sort of like key thinkers in philosophy like Kant and Hegel and Descartes, and like a lot of these people who are speaking further and further into slavery and around slavery. And on the other hand, you've got abject, essentially moral rights failures all across the world, saying, well, on the one hand, we can say the human is the epitome of moral consideration, but not those humans. And you've got this real distinct problem where, on the one hand, you can't classify humans as one collect moral group, because obviously there are different kinds of humans in these philosophers' eyes. It says, well, no, we don't consider black people to be completely human because of X, Y, and Z, and we can use them in other ways, much like we use animals. And I might touch on this a bit later, but the closer you get to animality, is understanding then how badly we can treat humans, because we have a base moral standard of which we can go down to. But if you're talking from a moral position, that in these philosophers' eyes, the white, heterosexual, able-bodied, cisgendered man, white man especially, is the top of the moral food chain, as you will. The sort of the knocks back that you get, like a white woman, a black man, a black woman, these sort of things where you push back what it means to be human in some ways, like what is the height of humanity, is the white man. As soon as you push back from these things, you start to get closer to nature. You start to get closer to this notion of like savagery, barbarity, non-civility, non-sentience, non-rational, non-thinking creatures that rely on their base primal instincts to survive, rather than having this level of like enlightenment or rationality or civility or sentience, where that's something that only true humans hold. Now, obviously, the Human Rights Declaration did wonders to raise the living standard, or the sort of the moral standard of all humans, regardless of obviously like race, gender, sexuality, etc., etc. But then the problem comes when we think about animals in this equation, is that there's this schism between animality and humanity. And this is where a lot of my research resides, is like, well, what did we do when humanity became the benchmark of moral consideration? Because now we need to include animals into this criterion, which essentially say, well, you've got to be a thinking, rational, sentient being. And we know these things through a lot of, hundreds of years of Enlightenment thinking, that humans possess these qualities. And as we know now, all humans possess these qualities, regardless of any kind of gender or, race and that sort of stuff. And obviously these things have big question marks around their identities as well. Like, what is race? How is this socially constructed? We can look to, lots of critical race theorists around this, and we can look in many dimensions to say, well, all of these other things that we construe as sex and race and gender are constructed anyway. But back to the animal point, it's now, how do we get the animal to the same moral point or position that humans have now ascended to? And does that then degrade the human? Does that ascend the animal? Where does nature sit in all of this? Like, there's so many big questions that Enlightenment tied up in a system of hierarchy and a system of hegemony, which is essentially just one perfect true idea. The great thinkers like Descartes and Newton, they're all trying to aspire to this, the one key thing that will solve the mysteries of the universe. But as we know, and as we look to nature, biodiversity and a diversity of views, all of these things are crucial and key to actually unlocking lots more things that we didn't understand about the world. And I feel like Western, or the Western philosophical tradition, has always tried to push us at this sort of knife edge and say, well, here is the one true thing in the world. If it wasn't Hegel saying, it's this, it was Kant saying it's that, it's, Wittgenstein saying, I've written the last book that ever needs to be written in the philosophical tradition. All these thinkers that were really like, this is it, this is the one truth, forgetting, the tens of thousands of years that indigenous culture spent understanding nature from a completely different perspective, and how we just sort of came into these geographies and were like, well, we're just going to do exactly what we were doing back home and ruin any kind of hope that we had in a relationship with nature.
It's interesting that, if you think about all the different patterns of thought and ideas that people have had, as you just brought up, and they all have some of their personal bias of how they try to explain the mysteries and the nature of the world. It's very intriguing that certain of those ideas become dominant and get more life and more play. It's kind of like, if you put it in modern terms, why does the idea of the self-absorbed self-interest and usurping of nature that comes out of the work of someone like John Locke, why does it get the most followers across time? I mean, you have to think about, how do these things live and breed in a context so that we end up in a modern era being a complete example of the mechanistic view of the world. We have become the machines that people like Newton and so on thought was the actual working order of the universe. In fact, there's no longer a way to separate us from the machines that dominate how we function in the world. I really believe down the road, if there is natural selection, we're going to be born with an iPhone attached to our hands at birth. if you really look at this. So the bottom line is, when you take a look at even like the philosophy of Locke, and you bring this up yourself, where there was no intrinsic value of nature. The only value nature had was how we could monetize it and extract wealth from it. And it led to the whole idea of consumerism and materialism to such a degree. So why do you feel that within the context of all of these lines of thought, these certain lines take such major hold and get such life and breathe such life over centuries, when they are really ways of thinking that have only really disconnected us even more and more from the natural world, and have led to us really making choices that create the man-made catastrophes that are a byproduct of where we are now? I find that very intriguing. What do you feel gives breath and life to certain philosophies over others that can lead to such a downfall of the civilization itself?
It's a tricky one. I think if we were to reduce this down to its base component, it's something to do with power. And I think if we look at the way that Western society, or the global North, or European society, was formed for many, many years, it was through monarchies, it was through ascensions of power and hierarchies, which demanded a form of centralized power. Right. And that's no different when you look to things like capitalism, and you look to traditional systems of corporations and their hierarchies, where you've got like the CEO and all that sort of stuff. When you think about feminist ethics of care, when you think about biocentrism or ecocentrism, when you think about indigenous ways of thinking, and I'm careful not to sort of collectivize their thought, as obviously there's right. a wide range of indigenous thought about these sorts of issues. But the majority that I've researched and I've read about in these ways speak to more of a communitarian aspect. They speak to decentralized forms of power. They speak to a condition of reciprocity between self and other, which just doesn't appear in a lot of the narratives in the West. And you see that this knife edge gets sharpened throughout time when we go from the contractarians and we go through into enlightenment. And it talks about the individual, it talks about the ego, it talks about the I, it talks about right. the consumer, it talks about, the customer is king. All of these things point to a sort of like a sharp edge, which say everything about me is the most important thing in this world. Now, once you take away God and you say, okay, everything is important about me in this world is me, but there is still a God. Once you take away the theological aspect, once you take away the spiritual, once you take away the metaphysical, once you take away anything intangible, so that everything that you can possibly know and understand is right in front of you, that's a very dangerous place to be. And it's not necessarily that anyone has to be particularly religious or spiritual and understand a deeper meaning to life. I don't think atheism is pushed out in that sense, but I do believe that if we are to live in today's society and not have something fundamentally greater than ourselves to strive to, take, for example, the idea and notions of Gaia or Mother Earth, or any sort of ecocentric narrative which places us in a greater web of life, which is of equal importance to us. We are one component that just exists in the great web of life. You then are left with this real problem where, okay, humans are the center of everything. That tree is now my bench, and that bench is going to be something which I can burn at whatever point. It's mine. This land is mine. This house is mine.
Right.
It's not a shared experience. It's not something which we can take away and say, okay, this tree, I can breathe the air this tree shares with me, but this squirrel lives in this tree and these birds live in these trees. And, you don't recognize others. And I think this is where we see, often in the UK and often in America, the problem around homelessness and the problem around property rights and the problem around ownership and the problem of accumulation of wealth. These are just individual outcrops of one bigger problem, which is the accumulation of power. And obviously power comes in the form of capital and in the form of, money in right. a lot of ways. So yeah, you see how a power dominant narrative in a philosophical sense really carries through, because it serves a very few powerful people that can maintain this narrative and select narratives which put up. I mean, we talk about Descartes, for example. There are a lot of female writers at that point that were speaking up against the aberrations of his writing, saying, no, of course nature has a voice. Of course nature isn't mechanic. Of course it's not, animals aren't just clockwork. How could you be doing this? But we don't ever hear about those people. We don't ever hear about these women who actually pushed forward the idea of compassion and empathy.
Well, that's true of women across all of history. They were denigrated to the back door anyway. I mean,
Exactly.
if you look at Rodin, you know, you had Camille Claudel, who was probably even a greater sculptor than him, as his protege, and she ended up in an insane asylum because she couldn't deal with the fact that, you know, they weren't acknowledging that kind of input. So that's a whole other level of male dominance through this. But it's very intriguing because that whole idea of consumerism, the idea was that the only path to happiness was self-absorption. I mean, that was Locke's whole model. The only pursuit of property and wealth was the only thing that was really the role of government, allowing people that option to pursue that. And nature was negated. The only value was, in fact, it was I love this quote. He was actually addressing Native Americans at that time, and he saw them as being people to be denigrated because they lived in this land, this country of tremendous land and natural resource, and they made no choice to exploit it. And he thought that that was as far away from human endeavor as should be possible. You know, so where can people get in touch with you? Where can they find you? Let's put that up on the screen so I don't forget to do that.
Yeah, so they can get in contact with me via the Animal Alliance website. Obviously, you might be able to find me on LinkedIn and other such places, but animalallianceproject.org is probably the best shout to begin with. We're building a whole host of other like-minded thinkers and like companies and organizations which share the animal liberation mission as well. So if you're ever feeling lonely in the community, the best place to go just to find other like-minded people.
Can you imagine how crazy these philosophers would be in the past if they saw the movements to establish personhood in animals that go on today? I mean, it would like really just kind of like in America, there's kind of an interesting dance of lawyers that are trying to establish the habeas corpus rights of animals. I was talking with people in the UK. I don't think you have the same kind of habeas corpus part of usual law, the rule of law in England. But that's a law in America that provides the protection of private citizens from being held in captivity. So what they've looked at are these animals that are in long-term captivity, and they've literally taken those cases to court. They're not easy to win because, you know, if they win a case, it's a precedent for freeing up a lot of other animals. But this idea that animals have personhood and sentience and agency, I don't think anybody can deny anymore. So I'm happy that that is getting a firm foundation, even in the overall legal system of looking at things, because I think that's one of the ways that we can start to have a more legitimate connection and realize that we're not above these creatures. We're partners with all of these species on the planet, you know, as we move forward and accept their personhood. And it's funny because we kind of do that with our pets. You know, they have a certain identity and personhood, and we wouldn't think at all of harming them. But yet when we get out of the home and we look at animals in general, it's amazing how many people have no connection or compassion or empathy for that other animal, that other species, when there should be really no difference, you know. So it's kind of intriguing, but this idea of personhood is a good step in the right direction. And you brought up a point before, and let's get into it a little bit more. And that is, you made the point that when we look at this Eurocentric philosophical tradition that has kind of supported this idea of self-interest being kind of the religion of the masses. This is what really should be the way we operate. We are above nature. We're here to use nature. We're here to monetize and create an economic value other than any intrinsic value that it may have. And you brought up the point that we have to have other paradigms that challenge that. And one of those you brought up, and I know it's an important one to you, is biocentrism. So let's talk a little bit more about that, because veganism is a very strong kind of biocentrism in itself. So let's see if we can talk about that and then link these ideas a little bit for our audience and see how we come to that discussion a little bit.
For sure. So when I do this in workshops, I get a lot of questions about how all these sort of centrisms fit together. And I think the easiest way to explain it is if you are a rock being dropped into a very, very still lake, you are the center of all of your moral consideration. And I think, you know, this, I've talked about, you know, the ego and the I, but in every moral situation or in every moral situation you come into contact to, you have to be the person you look after first. You know, regardless of, you know, being able to pull someone else out of a fire, you've got to make sure that you can get out as well. So if we go from this point, when we dropped into this lake of sort of like moral actions, you are the first thing that you should take care of. Then it extends out to your family, your friends, you know, your loved ones, your acquaintances, and the ripples start to go a bit further. That's all in the sort of the first ring of like human-centered ethics. That's what pretty much everybody on the earth works within, and they're fine with that construct. Everyone's happy with that kind of relationality. The next sort of bit out pushes into this sort of like sentience-based ethics, which is what Peter Singer talked about a lot in his sort of ethics. He said, you know, we must rely on some form of sentience or understanding to be in contact with someone and have that relationality between them. Most people are fine with that until such point as you point out that, okay, sentience extends to all mammals that we know. Obviously, I'm pretty sure that you can't relate, you know, mammals and then not fishes and have all these things connected together. But most people can go, okay, our pets are something we can have a conversation with. We can relate to each other. We have a moral understanding that I won't hurt them, they won't hurt me. There's a social aspect of relationality there. The next babble is then biocentrism. Now, biocentrism, there are a few different brackets and boundaries, but bio would normally sort of like mean bios or life, or, you know, the living things, the animated things. That doesn't necessarily extend out to things like trees and bacteria and viruses. Some biocentrists would push it to that far. I would, you know, go so far as like an ant, maybe that sort of level. But biocentrism in of itself pushes the boundary so far that says, okay, I'm going to respect the rights of myself. I'm going to respect the rights of other humans around me. I'm going to respect the rights of sentient animals around me. But I'm also going to respect the rights of potentially non-sentient animals, or things that I can't really say are something which I need to take care of in a sort of like a sentience-based relationship. Now, this challenges a lot of narratives. It challenges our ideas of person to person. It challenges how we should conduct ourselves in our purchasing, in our, you know, consumer-based worlds that a lot of us live in. You know, if I go to the supermarket and I buy, say, I don't know, a steak off a shelf, I am thereby ignoring the moral worth of that cow. And then if it's in plastic packaging and I don't get that plastic packaging recycled in such a way that it means it doesn't harm the environment, I'm going to be damaging, probably at the end of its life cycle, a lot of fish as well, a lot of things in the sea. And it extends it out in this moral community of others, which really challenges a lot of what we know to be what is right and wrong. Because if you're taking into consideration how an owl might feel, or how maybe like, I don't know, a tiger might feel, for example, how do I go about my day-to-day life worrying about treating morally those things around me, which I've never had to consider before? I've never had to consider the rights of an ant before. I've never had to consider the rights of a bumblebee before. Now I have to, because I'm having to not go out and harm these animals in a way that what people would consider immoral. Just like I wouldn't kick a dog in the face, now I can't squish a fly. And lots of people start to get very, very confused about how they should act and how they should be. And that's because we're raised so strongly in a human-centered ethic. It's very easy for us to think, I'm not going to hurt another human. But they will still buy clothing from Shein, or they'll buy things from Amazon, or they'll buy things from Temu, which oftentimes in the supply chain will have human rights abuses and, you know, child slavery and all this sort of stuff. It's because it's the distance and the relationality between people is broken. There is a far enough distance between the moral actor or the agent, the person who's making that moral decision, and those it will affect. And that sort of line of causation between those two is so easily severed by just a bit of physical distance, or even ideological distance. When we think about, you know, the horrors of human slavery, some people don't see slaves as humans. They just go, they're not in my moral consideration. And what biocentrism really challenges, and I think veganism is a good outcrop or a good explanation for that, is I wouldn't do something like this to a human. I wouldn't do this to an animal. I wouldn't do these sorts of things that I would consider immoral to a human, to an animal, or anything in the animal kingdom. Now, environmentalists often skip a couple of rows and go, we won't chop down the trees, but they'll still eat like meat and stuff, which I think is bizarre in my brain.
Which is a conflict. It's a major conflict, obviously. You know,
hugely, exactly.
I mean, can there be a biocentrist philosophy without being vegan? I don't really believe there can be. I mean, I think a priori you would have to understand that, you know, what you're eating, the consequences of what you're putting on your plate have an impact and resonate into things around you. They have consequences that affect everything around us. So in a way, veganism, if you want to call it a subset of biocentrism, to me is almost a foundation of biocentrism. I mean, how do you feel about that?
I would say it's an outcrop. I would say it's definitely an expression or a flavor of biocentrism, because if you look to countless, indigenous and non-Eurocentric communities around the world who do engage in the practice of eating meat and do engage in the practice.
Well, I get that, but that because they have a natural connection. Like, for example, Native Americans, when they killed a buffalo, they had about 200 uses for that buffalo. They revered that buffalo. That buffalo was a sacred creature in their, pantheon. And the bottom line is, I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about. It's really how we connect to the natural world with respect and empathy and compassion. So I see your point.
Yeah.
But I think in the modern times, though, there's no reason for us to kill that buffalo. The Native American had no choice. That was really what they lived with in terms of what was available for food and shelter and so on. I think you can make the case in modern society that we don't need to be involved in that harm and killing anymore. There's no reason to do that. So that's why I say that in a modern context, veganism to me would be a foundation for biocentrism, unless we really needed to do something else to survive. If I had to go fish to feed my family, I would do that, and I would still have, to my mind, a connection with the natural world with major respect, because I would see that as something that was connected to the survival of my family, and I would have respect for that. So I think it comes down, as you're pointing out, to this idea of how we see our connection to things, because really it's about really going past the disconnection that allows us to make man-made decisions that create catastrophe in the world. And I think that's kind of what we're dealing with now. So so when you talk about biocentrism and you talk about this idea of how we connect with a consciousness of respect for all living things around us and the natural world in which we live, to me, that's how I see a biocentrist philosophy. So if an indigenous person kills an animal, I see your point, that would still be part of that, because it's how they survive in the natural world. But we don't need to do that in modern society. We truly don't. There's no reason for us to kill an animal for food, clothing, shelter, or anything. And so to me, those are different things. But I see your point that indigenous cultures have that going on, and they are not necessarily vegan cultures.
I think veganism was more of a reactionary ideology brought about by industrialism and the industrialization of animal slaughter, and seeing how quickly things like capitalism can take one quite exploitative way or method of doing things and amplify that out by 1,000 times.
Right.
So from my perspective, I think what we're looking at here is sort of two slightly different narratives. I'm pushing from now into the future and sort of drawing from the past. I think what you're saying is, now, if nothing changes, the world can be vegan. I'm saying if things do change, we can look to sort of like solar punk or Afrofuturist.
So let's take that a step further. So I know that this is a big deal for you. How does the person, let's get into something practical, taking into consideration all of the evolution of thought that we've talked about, how does the person in a modern society right now look at bringing in biocentric principles into their lives to enhance and improve the quality of life and the planet on which we live? Let's get into something that's should be very real right now, because you made a point in your talk, and I loved it. We're way past the time for incremental change. The house is burning as we speak, and there comes a point now where we need to take very specific action for addressing some of the inequities that have transpired and are going on. And if they are not changed, the survival of us as a species and the damage to the planet will be possibly irreversible. We don't know that. Nobody knows what the future holds. So how do we bring a working model of biocentrism into a modern societal application? Let's talk about that.
So I think it's very crucial not to hegemonize any one sort of form of biocentrism. And this is to talk about the diversity or the biodiversity of thought in that sense. we need to decentralize a lot of what happened throughout globalization. If one region in like a sort of like a food desert in one part of the world says we want to be more in contact with nature and we want to be more in contact with our moral side, but we're going to have to kill and hunt seals to do that. Okay, this is one flavor of what biocentrism can look like. If, however, we are in the West and we are in going down to our local supermarket and buying things off a shelf that came from another part of the country, you need to be a lot more radical with your ideas of biocentrism. And this is why you look to something like veganism, which is more of a sort of a reactionary ideology within biocentrism that says, I will forego trying to even be a part of this sort of like globalist ideology that says I can buy anything from anywhere. People need to really, really rethink where they are in life and think, where do I want to be in 10 years? This isn't like a, where do I want to be in 10 years, 50, 60 years ago? This is a, where on earth do I need to be geographically in the world? Where do I need to be spiritually to, potentially put up with what's going to be happening to the, to the global climate, to the potential water shortages, the famine, the global catastrophes, the mass migration that could be potentially coming. We need to be thinking in systems wildly different to the ones we're thinking in currently. So the biggest thing for me is to look at biocentrism with almost like wide open eyes and say, how do I embrace something like a deep moral change within me? I mean, I'm lucky, I'm privileged to have had, 7 years of this journey to get to where I need to go. And it's partly why, I started the Animal Alliance Project, is to find communities where you are, to be a part of communities of change. Because we're going on a journey, whether we like it or not. And I think that's where biocentrism comes in a lot of the time is, if you want to go on this journey, you must recognize that there is something greater than the mechanistic, this sort of mechanical nature that's around you. There is a deep relationality that you share with the natural world around you. And you've got to figure out your place in that. You've got to figure out, where do I stand in the grand scheme of things? Should I be doing the job that I'm doing? If you're working in advertising, for example, should I be creating that new advert for Shell? Or should I be helping my company to pollute and produce meaningless things for meaningless activities? What am I doing on this planet right now that is going to benefit it? And how can I make that change? And how can I feel better about myself as a human in a very imperfect world? Because at every opportunity, capitalism will try and get you back to that point of comfort and safety in a consumerist narrative. So you just sit on your settee at night or a sofa, watch Netflix, watch Disney Plus, buy things the next day on Amazon. It's a very, very comfortable place to be, but it's not a comfortable you want to be in. Your house is on fire and you're on the sofa and going, I've got another 5-10 years of being comfortable in the sofa, but you're not going to have a chance to get out the door,
Right.
So that's where biocentrism.
Let me understand then how the Animal Alliance that you've created addresses that dialogue. What are you actually doing with that alliance to open up this conscious, engaged dialogue and activism in that direction that you just so clearly described?
So what I was doing with the Environmental Alliance Project before the new Animal Alliance Project was basically creating workshops, and it was creating opportunities for people to learn and connect with like-minded individuals and organizations and charities that were doing environmental liberation well and environmental rights well. The Animal Alliance Project is geared purely at animal liberation. It's not looking for welfarist narratives. It's not looking for incrementalism. It's not looking to how we can make the lives of farmed animals better. We need to deconstruct and dismantle these oppressive systems of animal agriculture and animal exploitation and factory farming altogether. We move towards a brighter future that says we will not abuse animals and we will not treat the natural world in the same way that we were treating it. And the Animal Alliance Project basically gets organizations that have this mission at their heart that says animal liberation is key to getting us out of this mess. Here's the people that are doing it. And that could be animal liberation specifically, or that can be more of a total liberation narrative. And as I mentioned towards the start, the idea that all oppression is rooted in animal oppression. Everything that we can do to an animal is only a degree of separation between what we can do to an animal and what we can do to a human. If we look at incarceration in the US, I can't remember who wrote it. I might be able to send it to you, but there was a wonderful study done about the parities between the US carceral system and, the prison system essentially, and factory farming, and how the two were pretty much built upon the same foundations, the way that they were built, the way that you shuffle people from one place to another. And it's scary to see the similarities as to how we oppress people and how we oppress animals.
Well, it's interesting. In the U.S., even on a domestic level, there is something in the criminal justice system where they have clearly defined, and this is through the major judicial system in the U.S., that when there is an increase in animal abuse, even in the home, there is a significant increase in spousal and child abuse that goes hand in hand with it. So this point of the extension of violence is a very real point. And I think our audience needs to know that the point you just made is a very valid and important point. That once you condone violence in one form, especially in an animal abusive form, it's very naturally or abnormally naturally spreads into violence across the spectrum of human interaction. And that's a very important point. We need to eschew violence in all ways, shape, and forms. And I think your point is a very strong and well-made point. Let me ask you one other point about this, though, because, and this is going to be, we're going to get into a little bit of religion just for a second, because I think it's interesting that those thinkers, starting with Bacon, who tried to remove God from nature, basically, and also the thinkers of the Enlightenment, felt that in a way they had to remove the concept of God from social structures, governmental situations, even scientific inquiry. And, that became kind of a force through the evolution of that thought. What do you feel about the need for that in the lives of people? Do you think they need to attach or have a sense of something bigger than themselves to be part of in their work, even in a biocentrist way? Do you feel that there's a place for that kind of consciousness of a divine mind or something bigger than ourselves to kind of foster a certain kind of compassion and empathy and love in the population and the world we're trying to create? What do you feel about that?
I think there's a two-part answer. The first part, and I'll speak to more of the historical side of things. Philosophically, especially in the Western philosophical tradition, not necessarily pointing to the contractarians like Hume and
right.
and stuff, but more talking about Kant, Descartes, that sort of stuff. There was almost, and even looking back to someone like Spinoza, I guess, but talking more about the theological, people always had to pander to this idea of a theological grounding in every aspect of their philosophy, because God essentially was the one true answer to everything. Everything revolved around this idea of how do we understand God? How do we understand power, essentially? How do we understand the concept of power? The difference in my eyes is organized religion versus spirituality. The centralized powers of that time around monarchy and organized religion were, of course, how do we keep power within an organization such as the church? How do we spread our influence, such as the Crusades? How do we retain power in systems of hierarchy, like the ascension of the throne and the sort of the monarchy and all that sort of stuff? You look to the historical context of philosophy, and you understand that God sat in that place because there was nothing else to look to that was of a higher power. When we get to something like Nietzsche, for example, and he talks about the death of God, he was talking about the death of theology and ideology in the form of religion. He wasn't necessarily saying that God died. We didn't commit deicide. It wasn't anything like that. It was a case of the people stopped believing in a greater power such as God because they saw that a greater power that was more affable and could influence change was something like capitalism or imperialism or colonialism. And they bought into this notion that, yes, God may be on our side, but it's governments that are doing the work for us. It's, we will separate out church and state. I can have my religion and still not then be a part of something, not as great. I can now have my cake and eat it. I can have my spirituality, but I can also have all the power. Fantastic. I don't have to rely on God. So now when we're talking about how does someone look to a more of a collective faith or a collective ideology, I say find what is good in the world and grab it, cling to it. Whether that's your community, whether your belief is in that my community will get me through something. And that could be your church, that could be your spiritual group, that could be just your friends. Whatever it is, find your spirituality and stick with it. It needs to be something which is unshakable. It needs to be something which you can return to constantly. If biocentrism is that thing, if you say, yes, the idea of Mother Earth is the thing that I cling to. I mean, there was recently I read an article where a lawyer in the UK swore an oath on one of his local rivers. Fantastic. If that's going to be his unshakable duty to make sure that river is unpolluted and sacred, amazing. Find something like that and cling to it. I don't think biocentrism necessarily needs to have a theological or spiritual sort of grounding in order for people to really get behind it. But I do believe that in the coming times, people are going to need something that is unshakable, or definitely far more solid than the society in which we live, because I do believe that what we understand to be society will start to collapse. The layers will start to peel back, and the real inequities will start to show through in their true colors. So you need something other than what we have currently to really fall back on and to really believe in, to get you through the coming years and to aspire to something better, to reimagine those things which we take for granted at the minute.
Yeah. So where do you see your work going? Where do you see the Alliance going? What's on the horizon for your personal interests? What would you like to be involved in as we go forward?
I would like to be involved in, the big conversations. I take my privilege as essentially a white man in this world, and I have to check it a lot of the times and say, my voice isn't a place for the center of the conversation. It's not something which needs to be spoken about. I will give my ideas freely and gladly to those who want to hear it and understand it. But the conversation, it needs to be decentered from whiteness. It needs to be decentered from the patriarchy. It needs to be decentered from these colonial ideologies, which I myself, unfortunately, are still trying to peel back the layers of. Right. So I want to be anywhere and everywhere someone will take me, because I'm so super interested in this work. But equally, I understand the point of my voice, and I understand the power that my voice holds, and the way that certain communities will feel silenced or disenfranchised, or limited in their own voice and power to speak out when someone like myself is in the room, because that's all that their community is known, is to be silenced by the white man. That's just an unfortunate outcrop of how I look. And at any point, if someone wants to challenge my bias and say, hey, you need to check this, I want to learn personally. But yeah, I'll be anywhere. So the Alliance project in of itself is something which doesn't rely on me. Whilst it says, I'm a director, this is just a point for the CIC. This is the UK government saying who's in charge, but It's a collective. It's a group of people that are all trying to make change, and it's a diverse group of people. And I want people to come on board who are diverse and have a plurality of views that challenge my own, that challenge the notion of what it means to be a vegan, or what it means to be a biocentrist, but all are working towards the goal of animal liberation. Because no matter what happens, we're all human, and we all have to live on this planet. There isn't going to be this Bezos-sized rocket that takes us out into space. Elon Musk isn't going to say, hey, come aboard, guys. There's room for 7 billion of us. We have this one planet. We need to find something that gets us to a place of betterment.
Yeah, many of those things, including animal liberation, for me, are the essence of spirituality, frankly. So as we wind down, do you have any final words you'd like to share with the audience out here?
Yeah, I mean, I often like to end workshops on a point of hope and say, if we look at the pushback that we've seen from a lot of powerful lobbying communities. I look to my work in the environmental rights communities, and I look at the fossil fuel lobbies, and I look to the big agriculture lobbies, and I look to the big medicine lobbies that are funding lots of antibiotics that get plowed into animals. There's something that's going on that's making them scared. There's something that we're doing. There's some collective action that is making them scared. We've just got to keep doing what we're doing. We've got to keep pushing this direction. Where it hurts the most for them and where they push back the hardest is where we need to push further, where we need to go further in and say, right, well, what is propping you up? Is it the subsidies? Is it the legal loopholes? Is it some form of collective delusionment that you've given the general public that we need to push back on and make them aware of what you're actually doing to them? Is it the unimpeded gaslighting that you've been doing for decades and generations through advertising and marketing campaigns that say fossil fuel is fine, eat meat, go out and consume and pollute, it's absolutely fine? We need to be challenging those things and find hope in the sense that we're doing something right, and that there are people out there. The weight of the world does not rest upon any one person's shoulders. And I think this is something which I find a lot of the time activists take every single loss in the world to heart. And I'll say, that isn't your fault. If you can make ethical change, take that win. If you can say, I did this amazing project, look at how well that went, fantastic. Thank yourself, thank the community that helped you to get there. but don't take every single loss personally. It is going to be an uphill battle, but I feel like we're doing something good. I feel like there are things happening out in the world, especially when you look on, the websites that I'm building as well. Like there are so many positive things happening, and you just need to jump into one of these communities to find a world of people which are on the same page as you, and you can share those interactions and those worries and those fears with, that understand you. And I think that's the biggest solace, is that there is a large enough collective out there that we can really start to make some amazing change.
Well, I can't thank my guest, Stuart Evans, enough for joining us today. And I think we all can appreciate this message of collaboration, compassion, connection. That is something that we need to foster to move forward, to create the kind of compassionate, loving world we all want and we all need at this particular point in time, for sure. And I urge you to follow Stuart. You can see his URL scrolling across the screen. For more information, you can tap in, you can connect, you can become part of this liberation of animals and some of the changes in the world that we all are really needing to make right now. I want to thank the audience, the people out there that have joined us today. Without you, we can't do what we do. I want to thank you for being part of this very active, healthy community. And on behalf of the National Health Association, I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I look forward to being with you on the next episode of the Health Science Podcast. Stuart, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Frank.
You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.